It has to be official. It's been a minute. We've talked about a whole range of things, and so I'm really glad that you have joined us. So I want to more officially welcome you, Joon Yang, to our Journey of Voices, the conversation. Really road mapping what your journey's been, where you are, what it's looked like, and how you've persisted through those things. So that way we can zoom out and try to help everybody else along their journey. By leveraging some of those insights and lived experience. So I want to actually pass it over to you, just so you can give us a little bit of the magic, a little bit of the intro about yourself and who you are.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andreas, for having me. I know that uh, a little bit of background story for people who are watching this. The context is Andreas was the star of the school. We met in high school, and he came in our sophomore year, right? And I was basically, I was a bit of a nerd, but I thought that I had some sports skills. And so out of all places, we met also out on the football field playing American football. And was I the fourth or fifth string? I forget, something along four and five. And I think Andreas was definitely the star of the football team. And I always wondered, how does this guy have so much panache and just I the speed and the strength was one thing, but I think as much as off the field and on the field, he was just both a charismatic character. And I always wondered, how can I be better friends with this guy? And it's kind of crazy. It only took 10 years for us to be sitting here and for you to come to me and say, hey, I kind of want to talk to you. So I think if I had a time machine to go back to 15-year-old me or 16-year-old me and say, hey, he's gonna actually want to talk to you at some point. I think that's gonna be something that makes my day in the past. So thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I guess I can start off by talking a little bit about myself and my background. As Andreas mentioned, my name is June, and I am from Seoul, South Korea. I was born and raised there. I came to boarding school in the United States for high school, and then went to college. And now I'm based off of Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is about an hour outside of Boston. I currently work as a quantitative developer at AJO, which is an investment management firm that's based out of Philly. We also have an office in Boston, and I'm also the co-founder and president of Raise Uganda Now, which is a nonprofit that works sort of as a safety net for children in rural communities. In particular, we run an orphanage, among other projects in rural Uganda. So that's sort of a little bit of an intro about me.
You're giving us a little bit of glimpse into the magic, and you're skirting over it and downplaying it. I mean, you absolutely did your thing in high school, and before there, that's how you got into Phillips Exeter. And of course, even after that journey, because you have to be resilient to go through, and I think from a mental health perspective, to stay grounded, through that experience, the more you kind of look and think about, what that whole process was. But I mean, even to hit pause before we go in, because I really want to highlight all of the richness and the insights that you really have. Let's take it back to Seoul. Let's take it back to Korea and that environment kind of growing up. So the people, the places. I've had the privilege to go and be in Jeju and Daegu and Seoul, but it was a while
Nice.
ago. So why don't you give all of our viewers and everybody else a little bit of insight for you, especially what was like?
Yeah, I mean, Seoul, so Seoul versus the rest of Korea is kind of like, not exactly like, but similar to thinking about New York City versus the rest of the United States. You can say that it's, the crown jewel, if you will. It's the most populated city in the country. There's about 10 million people who live in Seoul proper, and about another 15 million within the satellite cities. And considering that South Korea's population is about 55 million, you're looking at about half the population living in, say, in the New York City equivalent of the United States. It would be in the boroughs and maybe the tri-state area. So that's a lot of concentration. Um, so what does it mean to grow up in a place like that? Well, one thing, there's a lot of energy and sort of a really, really fast pace of exchange of ideas. And I think you can sort of notice that in the administrations, how quickly the policies are changing. You can also notice that in the different forms of how democracy is represented, both in sort of the government as well as within, say, the classroom, because you would see how these, depending on the educational curriculum, depending on the culture and how dynamically it's shifting. As a child growing up, I really did notice that yes, it was the same country, but I was noticing very broad strokes of change throughout my elementary and middle school life in Korea. And finally, I think this is a more nuanced point and goes back to sort of one of my biggest passions personally in sort of all fields is the idea of language and how language reflects culture, it reflects our identity. And Korean as a language is one of the fastest sort of evolving and developing languages. Just to give you a little bit of a background story here, Korea is a very old country. Of course, we know Korea as being the only divided country today after um, the huge Korean War and what people call the proxy war between USSR and the United States. There's a lot of issues there, but even before then, it's a country with thousands of years of history. And yet, the Korean language, even though it was spoken, the written form was only developed in the 15th century. And so, here is a language that really developed quite recently, considering the length of the history of the country. And because it was so developed so recently, and by what I would argue one of the first R&D labs the country has ever had, because King Sejong hired a bunch of researchers and scientists and said, hey guys, you guys are going to be holed up here and you guys are going to come up with a language that everyone can speak, because illiteracy is a huge problem, because we're all using Chinese characters to represent things that really doesn't match up with what we're speaking. So what that meant was a lot of innovation and creativity, and to be fair, a pretty recent construction of a language was put forth in the 15th century. And so what we have today is a very flexible language, one that is very uh, able to sort of organically change and be shortened. And that has been one of the core things of, I think, Korean culture that for me, having come to a foreign country and I guess as a first generation immigrant here, allowed me to be a lot more adaptable to not just the language, but frameworks and thinking as well as people. So I would attribute a lot of my flexibility and adaptability to both the Korean language as well as the culture that sort of shaped me.
And I appreciate how you deconstructed that, because it's I mean, just even looking at the language element, absolutely. How pervasive it can be in terms of really enabling people to have agency, or collaborate or mobilize or do any and everything, right? I mean, and that's why when you look at in other places, right, the context of people not allowing persons who were enslaved to read or have access to outside knowledge, and so communities and cultures grow. And as you said, being in a position where, by very nature, there's innovation embedded in the language continuing and growing and transforming, and then the factors of now we're in the digital age. So how is that increasing as people kind of spread out, but also have to stay connected? So as you're speaking to some of these things, obviously you're passionate about a great deal of things. But where did some of these passions, and then I want to hear about what are a few things that you would say you're passionate about are. But then even whether it's your upbringing or this community kind of the sense that you're speaking of, where have some of these passions been rooted?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say that there's a large part of it that I attribute to my parents. We used to travel a lot as a family, and we started our lives in actually when I was about 2 years old. That's when I first came to the United States for about a year and a half when my parents were doing their masters. So when they were they already had their undergraduate degrees in Korea, and my father was doing his LLM. So after he received his JD in Korea, there's an LLM program that allows them to become international um, attorneys. And so he was doing that. My mother was also attending management school in the United States. And so when I was about 2, 3 years old, that was the first exposure that I had to a completely different culture. And I went to Cranston, Rhode Island, of all places. So, if for those of you who don't know where Cranston, Rhode Island is, it's pretty close to Providence. I mean, Rhode Island is the smallest state in the country, so it's not too far. But it's also, at least when I was there, it was a silver town. So there was a lot of retirees who were living there. We were the only Asians in like a 100-mile radius, and I went to Budlong Preschool. And Budlong Preschool, which I recently had a 20-year reunion. Again, a pretty wild concept to have a preschool reunion. But they all remembered me because I was the only Asian kid back then in 1997. And so they were saying, "Oh my God, like we haven't seen you in a while." And they all like sang the kind of teasing songs that I used to sing. That was very Korean, like, you know, teasing song. And they had a lot of memory in that. But I also remembered so much of my early 3 to 4 year old childhood then, because it was such a huge culture shock. I didn't speak a word of the language. I was thrown into an environment where nobody looked like me. Um, but at the same time, it was within this small community of a really homogenous community, in fact, that they were able to love me and accept me and let me grow. And I think that even when I went back to Korea, between the ages of, say, 5 and 12, I don't think any sort of single moment or series of memories really stand out as much as my year and a half period of being here when I was in preschool and kindergarten. So that's one thing that really, I think, formed my ability to be open and to be, say, more of to be more susceptible to having not just one but multiple identities and multiple frameworks to work with. So I would start the clock there, and then of course there's high school and college where I was sort of being more and more exposed to a variety of approaches. I think one of the one of the things about Korea in particular is because it's a very uh, scarce country. I mean, it's such a small country in terms of size, and yet there are so many people living there. So what's the greatest asset of Korea, especially South Korea? It's human resources, it's education. And that's why, for me, I mean, one of the reasons why I sort of dove into the nonprofit scene, of course, is because I'm thinking about what is necessary for a community to build itself out of situations. And it really came to the understanding of how integral the role of education, the access to education, the ability to make education fun. Again, who are we educating? If it's going to be children, they need to have fun. And what I noticed was that there was a huge amount of emphasis in education in Korea, but not much flexibility in allowing for kids to approach it in different ways. I found a lot more of that here in the United States. And I think moving forward, that has sort of built more of a passion for how can we really frame learning and education in general to be more something that kids would want to enjoy and want to be a part of. So that's part of the journey of how my passion for um, language and understanding different frameworks of thinking bled into education.
I appreciate the reality, and then the contrast of you kind of digging, into I think what I would say, the intersections of those things, where culture and tradition, but then also innovation are constantly at, this crossroads, and especially now with COVID and other, all of the spaces, I think especially education, health and care and justice, all of these things where it's human capital and human potential now, um, are being challenged to redesign and pivot, um, because they haven't necessarily been designed from a human centered lens, or from kind of the client centered approach. which is very interesting. And obviously, as tech is coming into play, I
Right.
mean, I would say maybe I'm a little biased because, of course, we do work in space, but I think it's so critical that more and more of these conversations are had because, especially if you do not have, and again, I think that's something that I very much so appreciate, and I know that adds to the stress and the tensions. But that Korea as a nation is, as an outsider and as someone who's my uncle has lived there for dang like 15 years or something like that.
Wow.
Um, but being a culture and a nation that's really around like mobilizing and enabling, not just for, I would say, like, the combination of having, the reserves, and also of really promoting, not that I would say English is the best language, but, promoting the sense of needing to have multiple ways to communicate, and being able to, infrastructure the means for people to be committed and have priorities that are set in a different way. And it's needed so much because when we're talking about, and contrasting that to maybe Western nations where there's not that uniform social cohesion or traditional or cultural cohesion, and a lot of those things actually kind of, like we were saying earlier, whether it's with politics or around these issues, they're very divided. So how can you mobilize human capital when you can't agree on what positive education looks like or what the right type of health and care looks like? So you're still trying to kind of spend time circling the issue before you dive in, rather than nations that are able to commit and mobilize around these things because it's a need. And
Yeah.
that's something that I think is so important, especially now in the digital era, and now with COVID continuing.
To be fair, it's really, I mean, I think it's one of those things where the question of how do you mobilize a people? How do you mobilize a group of people, whether it is for an ideology or for the furtherance of their individual benefit? How do you mobilize a group of people? That question, is a billion-dollar question, quite frankly, but it's also, it has a lot to do with the history of that group of persons. So if you take, for example, South Korea, um, we have a history of colonization. We were colonized by Japan for 36 years, and that is something that is very much present in our identity. We also have a very homogenous group of people, which is very unlike, say, the United States, where you have all kinds of different nationalities and ethnicities being represented. And it's because of these differences that you would see um, different feasibilities and approaches. For example, let's make this super germane. COVID, for example, South Korea has about a sixth of the population of that of the United States, and yet the total number of deaths in the country, I have to check now, but I think the last I checked, which was last month, was still under 500. 500. That is orders of magnitude different. And if you think about the fact that about half the country's population lives in a super dense Manhattan-like city, that's an astounding number. And yes, we were one of the first countries that were targeted or that were affected by it because of the proximity to China. But really, yes, we learned from MERS and from SARS, but a lot of the benefit really goes back to believing in science and also making sure that there is some form of contact tracing. Now, contact tracing, of course, is oftentimes viewed as being orthogonal to privacy. And you're right, like it would never fly or I don't think it would ever fly really in the United States, for example, to have our phones basically, we download an app, for example. If you go to Korea, regardless of whether you test positive or negative, you self quarantine for 2 weeks. And during that time, you have to download an app. And if you leave your compound, if you leave your house, someone from your local city district will call you and say, "Hey, sir or madam, it seems like you've gone beyond your premise. Like, is everything okay?" And that's the degree of contact tracing that sort of helps with containing the numbers. Is that feasible for other countries? Not really. This is also the same country that during the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 1998, literally because the country, South Korea, had about 300 billion in foreign exchange debt, you see an entire country mobilized to literally, there was a thing called the Gold Collection Campaign. Citizens of the country just came out and donated their own gold to the country, about 220 tons of it, without any reward. They just said, you know what, here's my gold. The country needs to pay back its debt to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Here's my gold, take it. That's not something that's easy, but I wouldn't say that it's something that is necessarily because Koreans are good at their core per se, but because there's a shared history, there's a shared idea of, you know what, when things look really, really bad, such as, and we don't have to go that far back in history to remember what it really means to be have our livelihoods taken away from us. When things get really bad, we have to come together, and that's the kind of mobilization that I think, whether it's in a digital age or not, we need to think about how we can engender that to happen.
I completely agree. Especially where this whole era I really think is really based on. I mean, value. Value in the exchange in it. The adjustment in everybody's priorities, and how are we going to come together? When are we going to come together? With who and why?
Hmm.
And then how our perception of the value in each of these relationships or exchanges has shifted. And exactly as you're saying, the collaboration or the collaborative element is so critical to success in this space for any nation, for any community, for uh, any
Absolutely.
person. And so, as you're speaking about this, this tension of a cultural trauma, of a identity trauma, of kind of the shared consciousness and the trauma of the Korean persons of Korean descent,
Hmm.
and not that it's the same, but that is the unity. When you look at the trauma in the Jewish community or in the Afro diaspora community, or other these things. But the reality, as you're saying, is you still have to be able to mobilize, and whether that's economically, whether that's politically, whether that's around food and sustainability or education, that is a reality, because these are these stressors in the system, whether it's COVID or, as you said, an external factor that is, it's just economic. We owe a lot of money, and it's due, or there's an imbalance in this. We have to offset it with this. Um,
Hmm.
that stance is critical. So when you tie that to, I guess how all of that wider trauma or lived experience, and as that kind of comes to yourself, along your journey, you've definitely been challenged in different capacities. You've had setbacks or points where you needed to pivot. So I would love if you could give us like one or two. But speaking to, I guess, really, what was that experience like? This situation happened, and then how were you able to propel yourself through it?
Yeah. I guess in order to answer this question, I have to go a little bit deeper into some of the stuff that I already talked about. So when people generally think about what does it mean to be bicultural, or what does it mean to embody multiple cultures in one body, what does that mean? And I think a lot of people think it's pretty cool. I mean, people are impressed when somebody shows 3, 4 passports, and it's like, oh my god, this citizen of the world kind of thing. And I also find it really fun and cool to be a polyglot, for example. I think I genuinely believe that the more languages you speak, the less likely or the less possible it becomes for someone to be a bigot. Just because you can't possibly have a myopic or parochial mindset when you speak multiple languages that eh, in and of themselves embody so much culture, religious aspects, stories within the language. And if you can speak many of them, you cannot possibly think that there is only one possible way of viewing things. And I think um, for me, that sort of was at the basis of how I wanted to accept more things and challenges in my life. But there are also things that really make it a bit more challenging in very real terms from a day to day perspective. So the more you feel like you are becoming, for example, in my case, I lived right about half my life, about 13 years of my life in Korea, and another 13 in the United States. What that means to me personally is that it took me a while, but I feel like when I am speaking in English with, say, English speaking people, I embody 100% a full identity of being more American. When I speak in Korean with Koreans, I then embody 100% of my Korean identity. It's not like when I'm speaking one language versus another, I'm a 50-50 sort of mix, if that makes sense. What what is really troubling though is that just because you're 100% that identity doesn't mean that you forget about the rest. So when you are speaking with your friends, for example, when I speak with my friends from middle school in Korea, and we start talking about, say, politics or ideology or future prospects, what drives them, the perspectives become pretty divergent very quickly because for the past 12, 13 years, I've been living a very different kind of life. And I feel a bit foreign to them. And that experience, of course, is mirrored in when I speak to my American friends as well in a lot of cases. Especially in high school when I was a freshman, I remember I was watching through these TV shows on 2x speed just to get through them so I knew the content, so I could get references. So that when someone said, remember that episode in, SpongeBob, and I get to say, that was episode something, and I can sort of laugh along with it. And someone I remember my freshman year told me Gossip Girl was for some reason the essential American Identity kind of TV show that I had to watch. So I finished the first two seasons of it, and then I was trying to drop Gossip Girl quotes, and you can imagine how that went. So that's the struggle of trying the real struggle that's sort of hidden from view when people talk about being multicultural. But these sort of small jokes and episodes aside, I think it also goes to a much more fundamental question of then who what it means for a group of, say, bicultural people to come together and to share their experience, because in a lot of ways it's hard. I mean, I think that our ultimate goal as people on earth is in part, not the whole goal, but is in part to be understood. I think when an artist paints a painting, or if a musician composes a piece of art, or if a coder writes a beautiful program, or if a leader mobilizes a group of people, I think they're in the common denominator for all of those activities is at its core a struggle to exhibit a belief of an identity, and the expectation, or at least the hope, that other people would understand that it resonates with others. And in that sense, being or embodying multiple cultures is a very, very difficult position to be in order to feel like you are being understood, or that what you are saying truly resonates with not only one group but all the groups of people that you hope to be connected with. So that's a struggle that I think a lot of people, including my friends and myself, sort of undergo. There is no one or few answers to this question, but I think it is our journey of trying to answer that really makes, again, going back to the slightly cliche notion of it's really the journey that matters. And as much as the human struggle at its core is about finding meaning, or at least discovering what it means to find that meaning, that the journey is really what brings a lot of these groups of people together. And I think it's been at the core, the conversation, the communication, and the transparency with which groups of people like myself have been able to engage in. That was what really has helped me throughout my life in that journey.
The reality of the compounding factors, and all of the baggage, all of the lived experience, all of the tensions that everybody brings into these spaces, is also I guess, running parallel, but intersects directly, right, with language, because that is the weight that comes in with language. Like if you're able to connect, even if you never met somebody before, um, if you're able to connect with them over language, or if there's a few words, like just like this, the senses, right? If you've never met someone but they're wearing a scent or a smell that reminds you of something in your childhood, you're gonna go back there automatically. If you've never met somebody, before, but they're vulnerable about something that touches a couple notes, all of a sudden you're more willing to open up to them, and it, you know, you dive right in. So as you're speaking about that, it is kind of the, I guess, everyone's individual challenge, but also the opportunity to continue to explore yourself, but then also to challenge, I guess, the consistent challenge of like having to zoom out, right? And I fully agree with you. The element of language, is just like travel. The more you travel, you can't, like, you're no longer in a small box. So you're just like, at Exeter, you're in a situation where even if you don't agree with what's going on, you have to listen to people from all over the world. Um, for the most part, share their beliefs and values and ideals, or like why they think that, through body language, through words. And then even if you don't agree, you have to kind of process, you have to reflect, and still have to absorb it. And as you're saying with language, that's something that we as a people, in I think all of the contexts, have to commit to mobilizing, around travel and language, but doing it in ways that maybe reduce the barriers to access. Not everybody's going to learn 4 languages or 7 languages. And even if you travel and use the app, you'll only be able to get so much, because you're just word for word. That's not the you're not getting the cultural or the traditional kind of, oh well, this is how they say it. and this.
Right, that's the beauty. I mean, I think this ties well with what you mentioned about Exeter, because as you recall, the Exeter motto, or I guess the motto is the right word, is non sibi, right? It's not for oneself. And if you think about it, I always thought it was weird that a school's motto could be something about what not to do, right? It's usually done in the, I remember there was a, what is it, a Deerfield's motto was something like "Be worthy of your heritage," and I was like, I mean, that's kind of pretentious, but at least it's like, yeah, like we're something, and you should be worthy of that. There's that kind of value system to it about what you should do. But when at first I heard, it's talking about something that I shouldn't be. It shouldn't be about me. And I was like, maybe this is some, philanthropic, big picture that they want to instill in us so that we're making big donations later on down the line. But the more I thought about it, it was actually, it, it to this day is probably the phrase that I think about most, because what it did was, when, for example, I was okay at math. I'm Asian, so I'm okay with math. But at the same time, the the expectation was that, oh, here's this kid who's, from South Korea, so he should be good at math, and that was the expectation. That was what a lot of people thought I should do, and I wasn't bad, but it wasn't my forte either. But what I did realize was that when I met people, um, like Le Marie, who I think was from Alabama, and she, came into a multivariable calculus class in high school, and then dominated the 7 Asian boys in that class. That really blew my mind at that moment, because that was the only frame of reference that I had until then. And what it really helped me understand was, wow, I never really thought that math was that interesting, but the way that she solved those problems was just so creative, and it blew my mind. And I thought, maybe it's not about what I'm good at and what I really, really have a comparative advantage in, but it's about what other people do, what other people show me, the possibilities of their passions, and I can learn from that. And just because I'm not a math guru or a language guru, just because I can't speak 7 languages, doesn't mean that I can be interested and fall in love with language. And it was that reflection, the multifaceted reflections that I saw from my peers, from my friends, that helped me identify what it is that really constituted me, what I was interested in, what I loved, what I couldn't do. And so therein lied this. idea of, it's not, people talk about finding yourself and really doing a lot of self discovery. And yes, we should spend time meditating and having time to ourselves, disconnected from everyone else. But at least my interpretation of the non Sibi aspect and what it means to sort of be a part of this journey is sort of to say, okay, who are the friends around me? Who are the people who I really admire most? And what aspects that they embody do I really want to reflect? And can I have all those mirrors where this person represents my aspirations for, something, and this person represents my inherent ability to do something else. This person sees the best in me, and I know what that is. And when you have a collection of those, sort of like a mosaic, it sort of starts to come into focus what it really is that you're looking for. And I think that's the beauty and part of having a model that's less about you and what you can do for yourself, but once you start focusing on others and what you can do for them, it sort of naturally reflects back to you, and ironically it sort of sheds more light on who you are and what you want to be, which is integral to that journey.
And even putting a pin, putting a pin into that self aspect. Um, as we're mapping out the journey because it is, the journey of life, right, is one of discovery. It's one of, as you said, it's not so much about what problem, whichever problem it is. It's more about how you solve the problem, how you rise, and how you move around to, maneuver.
Yeah.
That also being the case, good sir, as you look back, or even just where you are right now, hitting pause and to reflect, what is a recommendation that you would have, or what is something that you would put a pin in for your younger self, whether it's to celebrate, or a younger June?
I think it would probably, I mean, I I have to preface this by saying I hate it when people say the usual, go and try everything. Don't be afraid to do anything, because that's kind of irresponsible. I mean, I there was a lot of stuff that I really wanted to do, and I guess if there were no repercussions to it, then I should have done all of them. But the fact of the matter is, there's a reason why I didn't do all of those, because I couldn't just drop everything from school and go off into the wilderness and write some text that I think was an epiphany, and then come back and pretend like it didn't happen, or pretend like it was just something that could really be integral. I mean, there's a time and place for a lot of these things, and that's why I'm always hesitant to give a sort of more dreamy, what's an advice that you would give yourself in the past. But but that being said, I think that if there was one concrete advice that I would try to give to myself, um, it's to it's to be both more critical of adults and more hopeful and interested in your peers, because I think that a lot of the perpetual cycle that we find ourselves in is in part the solution to, but also aggravates a lot of the existing issues. And when we look up to people who are older than us, who have more experience than us, we already have this attitude of, oh, because they're older, because he or she's an adult, because they're a teacher, they must know what they're talking about. But you and I both know that if we look back to high school, there were some people in their early mid or even late 20s who came in, and we were just like kind of taking their word for granted. Of course, like, you know, Mr. So and so or Miss Who and Who, they went to college and they know what life is all about. News alert, we're that age and we kind of don't know still. and and that's where I hope that there's a little bit more critical thinking when it comes to taking the advice of people who we would normally assume have the answers, have the keys to all these questions. That doesn't mean that we should be disrespectful to our parents or to our mentors or to the adults, but I think being a little bit more critical and asking the why and not taking just because as an answer is really important. On the flip side, I think we are also too quick to sort of disregard and disengage the advice or the thoughts or the silliness of our peers. But it's really that silliness that's at the core of innovation, especially when we talk about technology today. I mean, most of the technology that's really um, taking a lot of our attention right now, and building out these extended possibilities, come from what we might call pipe dreams, only 10, 20 years ago. It's also because of this movement of self-awareness about mental health, about being upfront about where we are and who we are, where we stand and who we are. That kind of dialogue that really started with, I think, millennials and also Gen Zers. I mean, it's a very youth and grassroots driven effort here in a lot of cases. And I think if I could go back to myself, I would say don't don't just say, "Oh, that's so silly. You're joking around," just because your friend or someone who is younger than you even is talking about it. Um, set set an hour. Just do as if you would be talking to your mentor. Take it seriously. Of course, it's not going to be pitch perfect and fully fleshed out, but give it a little bit more. Give it a little bit more of a chance, and I think that I would be really surprised by just how much exciting things that can come out of it.
I think that's readily applicable, to everybody in all situations where that is the reality. We kind of grow up and we take a lot of things for granted because it's seemingly that's the way it is, or that's the way it should be.
Yeah.
And the earlier you begin to question those things, the more momentum you have, and the more grounded in self you actually become, because it's celebrating your value, or understand that everybody has value. And that's one of the perspectives that I believe travel and language really do give you, because when you or studying history, if you can see
Oh,
civilizations
yes.
in every continent, the fact that there were all kinds of kings in Africa and all kinds of different, not just the main languages, in China, or in Korea, or across kind of Asia, or what is the Middle East, but understanding like the thousands of years of histories. And so, that gives you a different sense, when you step into these things, because like you said, you understand culture, you understand different nuances, even if it's not. I can speak to this language through and through, or I'm able to connect at the same level as this academic, or somebody in industry, but yet there's shared understanding and shared meaning, and that comes from peers, and that comes from mentors as well. And so, kind of, as we get ready to transition, I suppose, in one of the following parts, but I would say, this where what is it in 2020, on the tail end of 2020, heading into 2021, where
Are we
are
there
you
yet?
where are you, June Yang, where are you on your journey?
Even answering that question is part of the homework that I have for myself. I think um, to be able to answer the question of where are you in that journey sort of presupposes that I have a sense of relative, movement. Where was I in the past? Where do I want to be? And that's only then can you sort of say, okay, if that's where I was and if that's where I want to be, I must be right around here. Without that relative notion, it's sort of, it's just sort of saying, I'm here without any frame of reference. So I think to be thinking about that frame of reference is step zero, if you will. And in that sense, I think I'm just perpetually that is the main question for me is finding ways to stay grounded. Because I know that by my own, I just have a tendency to be very optimistic, hopeful about the future. I have this notion of it's about the direction, especially in our 20s and 30s. It's about the direction and not the speed. Um, so I always try to think about, okay, if I need to set a good direction, I need to first understand where I am. And that process of contextualizing my decisions and my aspirations is is um, is really hard, especially because technology moves so quickly, and we're thinking about what's happening, what are we thinking about, where are we going next, and I think the tendency is for a lot of people, if you look at the stock market, this is one example, not the only one, but you can see that in olden days, it used to be more fundamental value or intrinsic value driven. People would research, okay, like what is the book value of this company? What kind of accounting insights can it tell us? But now a lot of people, when they're picking stocks, they just sort of say, "Oh, a lot of people are doing this, so that must be good." There's a lot of group learning or herd mentality that's going on, and that's one way to react to a situation. But I certainly think that for me personally, when you ask the question, "Where am I in that journey?" I think my answer is I'm just trying to figure out without other people's insights per se, how do I construct my own frame of reference? And that's a never ending journey, but I think I'm getting better and better at considering what variables I should be thinking about. And in that sense, I think my my outlook now is to sort of to spread that as well. I think I, as a young individual, have, as I said earlier, a responsibility to make sure that other people as well who are sort of whether it's thinking about their identity or there's all this questions, especially from young people all the way to older folks about identity in terms of imposter syndromes or performance issues, and those kinds of things are very stressful indeed. But I think I want to play a bigger role in sort of as much as I want to be discovering where I am in that journey, I want to also help other people to make sure that they're willing to sort of disengage sometimes, think about it, and then come back and then talk to other people about where they find themselves.
And you already, touched on the, in terms of what's next, right? Continuing to build on that element. So I would say kind of the final transition, and it's picking up kind of on that notion, but zooming out on your whole story, this journey as it has been thus far, um, and then I would say flipping the mirror, right? As you referred to before, what message or um, what reflection would you like to give others? What do you hope others would take from your story?
Um, I would say take it with a grain of salt, and but I'd probably say, I mean, what I said earlier about the what I would say to my past self. I mean, I think there's a lot of communal anxiety that's building because of the rising uncertainty. I think there's too many variables at play. Um, Tech seems to be, I mean, you can just think about it in terms of the academic field being a reflection of the rest of the world. I mean, there used to be a time when a a journal or an article or a paper that was written in 1980s and 70s to be still super relevant, and you look at computer science and machine learning or AI related papers that are out now in 2018 as like an old paper, and you're thinking, oh my god, like how quickly are things really shifting. um, but as much as there's a huge movement of people around these things, I dare say that a lot of it is very distracting. And you say, what is the magic? And I think a lot of people expect there to be some magic, but um, I do believe that a lot of that magic is actually misdirection. And part of the message that I want to send to people is, how do you then discern between magic and misdirection? Is if and the way to do that is by sort of thinking about where is it coming from. Is if it's exclusively coming from outside sources and you don't believe in it, if it doesn't resonate with you, if you haven't done the research yourself, it's more likely than not that it's misdirection. if you've if the idea came from you, and no one else, if the idea came from other people or other sources, but you also find a fundamental part of you that resonates with that, and that could be as rigorous a process as, you know, spending a week doing the research to make sure that is correct, or something as simple as having a group of friends and discussing it, and thinking about how the different perspective bounce off from that idea and then accepting it as your own. I mean, that kind of critical thinking and engagement, I think, will really help us understand what out there, and this goes back to this idea of fake news and how quickly things are changing. But I think it's that process that will help us find a bit of solace in a otherwise extremely ungrounding and ever-changing world. So that would be my recommendation to people to sort of engage in that. It's time consuming. Sometimes it's not fun, but I assure you that the that the sense of calm and groundedness that we can come out of it with is so worth it.
I greatly appreciate those insights. I would say for this portion, if we could get your official sign off.
My name is Joon Yang, and this is my voice.